So I moved into this small town for a new job a couple years back. It was the first time I'd lived alone, and I was actually excited to have some space for myself, away from the usual city noise. The neighborhood was super quiet, filled mostly with elderly folks. It was one of those places where everyone knew everyone, so I figured I'd stand out a bit as the new kid. Anyway, everything was fine at first, but then I noticed this guy across the street. Let's call him Dan. Dan looked like he was in his 50s, but with the way he moved, you could tell he'd been through some tough stuff. He always had this distant look, almost like he wasn't really there. I didn't think much of it at first. Maybe he just liked to keep to himself. But as the weeks went by, I started noticing that he'd be out on his porch a lot, staring at my house. At first, I thought he was just looking in my direction, but after a while, it became pretty obvious he was watching me. One morning, as I left for work, I saw him standing by his mailbox. He waved, but it was one of those strange waves, like his hand was half-heartedly up and his eyes didn't match the gesture. I nodded and kept walking. When I got home later that day, I found an envelope tucked under my front door. It was from Dan. The note inside was short. Just 2 sentences. I saw you this morning. Don't forget to keep your curtains closed at night. That line made my stomach drop. I don't even know why. Maybe it was just how weirdly specific it was, like he'd been watching enough to know when I left them open. I brushed it off as a harmless neighbor thing, though, figuring he was probably just socially awkward. Things started to get worse from there. I'd come home and find stuff moved around, mostly just little things that made me question myself. Like my shoes would be in a different place than I'd left them, or my mail would be spread out when I knew I left it in a pile. I convinced myself I was just being paranoid or maybe absent-minded. I even stopped going to the gym because I kept feeling too uncomfortable about leaving my house unattended. Then, one night, I woke up around 3 a.m. to this weird feeling like someone was watching me. I peeked through the curtains and there he was, Dan, standing on the sidewalk right outside my house. He was just staring straight at my window, not moving, just standing there with that blank look. I remember my heart racing so hard I thought I'd pass out, but I didn't want him to know I'd seen him. I backed away and sat in the dark until he eventually went back to his house. I tried telling the police about it, but since he hadn't actually done anything, they brushed it off as weird but harmless. They told me to let them know if he did anything real. I felt stuck. It was like I was trapped in my own home, waiting for something to happen. Then came the night that really messed me up. I'd gotten into bed and checked the door twice, making sure it was locked. I finally drifted off, but I woke up with this overwhelming feeling of dread. The house was dead silent, and for some reason, I just knew someone else was there. I reached for my phone, trying to stay as quiet as possible, and that's when I heard it. Someone whispering, "It's open." I froze. I didn't know if I was imagining it, but I didn't want to stick around to find out. I grabbed my keys, dashed to the door, and booked it to my car. I spent the night at a motel across town, barely sleeping, just pacing the room, wondering if Dan was inside my house at that very moment. When I went back the next morning, everything was perfectly in place. Nothing moved, no signs of anyone breaking in. But the strange part? My front door was unlocked. That was the last straw for me. I put in a notice with my landlord and got out of there the next month.